Section 10 of Popular Superstitions and the Truths Contained Therein. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Superstitions and the Truths Contained Therein by Herbert Mayo. Letter 10. Mesmerism. Use of chloroform. History of Mesmer. The true nature and extent of his discovery, its applications to medicine and surgery, various effects produced by mesmeric manipulations, hysteric seizures, St. Vitus dance, nervous paralysis, catechus, initiatory trance, the order in which the higher trance phenomena are afterwards generally drawn out. Can no further use be made of the facts and principles we have thus seen verified and established than to explain a class of delusions which prevailed in times of ignorance? The powers which we have successfully employed to shake the nerves and unsettle the mind in the service of superstition, can they not be skilfully turned to some purpose beneficial to society? A satisfactory answer to the question may be found in the invention of ether inhalation and in the history of mesmerism. The witch narcoticized her pupils in order to produce in them delusive visions. The surgeon stupefies his patient to annul the pain of an operation. The fanatic preacher excites convulsions and trance in his auditory as evidence of the working of the Holy Spirit. Mesmer produced the same effects in his patients as a means of curing disease. It occurred to Mr. Jackson, a chemist of the United States, that it might be possible harmlessly to stupefy a patient through the inhalation of the vapor of sulphuric ether to such an extent that a surgical operation would be unfelt by him. He communicated the idea to Mr. Morton, a dentist, who carried it into execution with the happiest results. The patient became insensible. A tooth was extracted. No pain seemed to be felt at the time, or was remembered afterwards, and no ill consequences followed. Led by the report of this success, in the course of the autumn of 1846, Messrs. Bigelow, Warren, and Haywood ventured to employ the same means in surgical operations of a more serious description. The results obtained on these occasions were not less satisfactory than the first had been. Since then, in England, France, and Germany, the same interesting experiment has been repeated many hundred times, and the adoption of this, or of a parallel method, has become general in surgery. I withdraw from the present letter a sketch which I had made from the report of Dr. Hayfelder of the phenomena of etherization. For a year had barely elapsed when the narcoticizing agent recommended by Mr. Jackson was superseded by another, suggested and brought into use by Professor Simpson of Edinburgh. The inhalation of chloroform is found to be more rapid, uniform, and certain in its effects, and compassible in a similar manner than the inhalation of ether. Its brief phenomena are wound up by the production of stupor. They are remotely comparable to those produced by alcohol. Alas! The time is past when I enjoyed the means of looking through and forming practical judgment upon discoveries like the present. Not the less, however, do I hail the advent of this boon to the art of surgery. The conception was original, bold, and reasonable; its execution neat and scientific; its success wonderful. It established, in the year 1847, to the satisfaction of the public and of the medical profession, that the exclusion of pain from surgical operations is a practicable idea, and the attempt to realize it a legitimate pursuit. Then what is mesmerism? The object of the inventor of the art was to cure diseases through the influence of a new force brought by him to bear upon the human frame. Talent, for philosophy or business, is the power of seeing what is yet hidden from others. As the eyes of some animals are fitted to best see in the dark, so some mental vision of some original minds prefers exercising itself on obscure and occult subjects. Whoever indulges this turn will certainly pass for a charlatan. Most likely he will prove one. Mesmer had it, and indulged it, in a high degree. The body of science which I have unfolded in the preceding letters was wholly unknown in his time. He was born in 1734, but he was led by his wayward instinct to grope after it in the dark, and he seized and brought to upper light fragmentary elements of strange capabilities which he strove to interpret and to use. He had early displayed a bias toward the mystical. When a student at Vienna, he was by birth a Swiss, his principal study was astrology. He sought in the stars a force which, extending throughout space, might influence the beings living upon our planet. In the year 1766, he published his Lucubrations. In attempting to identify his imaginary force, Mesmer first supposed it to be electricity. Afterwards, about the year 1773, he adopted the idea that it must be magnetism. So, at Vienna, from 1773 to 1775, he employed the practice of stroking diseased parts of the body with magnets. But in 1776, happening to be upon a tour, he fell in with a mystical monk of the name of Gassner, who was then occupied in curing the Prince Bishop of Ratisbon of blindness by exorcism. Then Mesmer observed that, without magnets, Gassner produced much the same effects on the living body which he had produced with them. The fact was not lost upon him. He threw aside his magnets and operated, mostly afterwards, with the hand alone. It appears that he was often successful in curing disease, or that his patients not only experienced sensible effects from his procedures, but frequently recovered from their complaints. But in 1777, his reputation, which must have always hung upon a very slender thread, broke down through a failure in the case of the musician Paradis. So Mesmer left Vienna, and in the following year betook himself to Paris. There he obtained a success which quickly drew upon him the indignation, perhaps the jealousy, of the faculty, who failed not to stigmatize him as a charlatan. They exclaimed against him for practicing an art which he would not divulge, and when he offered to display it, averred that he threw difficulties in the way of their investigations. Perhaps he suspected them of want of fairness in their inquiries. Perhaps he was really unwilling to part with his secret. He refused an offer from the government of 20,000 francs if he would disclose it. But he communicated freely to individuals, under a pledge of secrecy, all he knew, for 100 louis. His practice itself gave most support to the allegations against him. His patients were received with an air of mystery and studied effect. The apartment, hung with mirrors, was dimly lighted. A profound silence was observed, broken only by strains of music, which occasionally floated through the rooms. The patients were seated round a sort of vat, which contained a heterogeneous mixture of chemical ingredients. With this, and with each other, they were placed in relation by means of cords or jointed rods, or by holding hands, and among them slowly and mysteriously moved Mesmer himself, affecting one by a touch, another by a look, a third by passes with his hand, a fourth by pointing with a rod. What followed is easily conceivable from the scenes referred to in my last letter, as witnessed at religious revivals. One person became hysterical, then another. One was seized with catalepsy, others with convulsions, some with palpitations of the heart, perspirations, and other bodily disturbances. These effects, however various and different, all went by the name of salutary crisis. The method was supposed to provoke in the sick person exactly the kind of action propitious to his recovery, and it may easily be imagined that many a patient found himself the better after a course of this rude empiricism, and that the effect made by these events passing daily in Paris must have been very considerable. To the ignorant, the scene was full of wonderment. To ourselves, regarding it from our present vantage ground, it presents no marvelous characters. The phenomena were the same which we have been recently contemplating, a group of disorders of the nervous system. The causes which were present are not less familiar to us, nor their capability of producing such effects. They were, mental excitement, here consisting in raised expectation and fear, the contagiousness of hysteria, convulsions, and trance. Its force increased by the numbers and close packing of the patients. The odd force, developed by the chemical action in the charged cauldron, developed by each of the excited bodies around, its action first favored by the absolute stillness observed, then by the increasing sensibility of the patients as their nerves became more and more shaken. It is remarkable that Jussieu, the most competent judge in the commission of inquiry into the truth of mesmerism, set on foot at Paris in 1784, of which Franklin was a member, and which condemned mesmerism as an imposture, was so struck with what he saw that he strongly recommended the subject to the attention and study of physicians. His objections were against the theory alone. He laid it down in the separate report which he gave in, that no physical cause had been proved to be in operation beyond animal heat, curiously overlooking the fact that common heat would not produce the effects observed, and therefore that the latter must have been owing to that something which animal heat, or the radiating warmth of a living body, contains, in addition to common heat. That something we now know, but only since 1845, to be the odd force. The odd force is so new, so young in science, that Mesmer's reputation has not yet been credited with the honor thence reflected upon it. I will not say that Mesmer's astral force was a distinct anticipation of von Reichenbach's discovery, which was no ways suggested by the former, and was from first to last an effort of inductive observation. But the guess of the mystic had certainly a most happy parallelism to the truth, which from a different sort of mind tracked in the same field. For the odd force reaches us even from the stars, and the sun and the fixed stars are odd negative, and the planets and the moon odd positive. It is unnecessary to follow Mesmer through his minor performances. The relief sometimes obtained by stroking diseased parts with the hand, that is, the effects obtained through the local action of odd, had been before proclaimed by Dr. Greatrex, whose pretensions had had no less an advocate than the Honorable Robert Boyle. The extraordinary tales of Mesmer's personal power over individuals are probably part exaggeration, part real results of his confidence and skill in the use of the means he wielded. Mesmer died in 1815. Among his pupils, when at the zenith of his fame, was the Marquis de Puysegur. Returning from serving at the siege of Gibraltar, this young officer found mesmerism the mode at Paris, and appears to become, for no other reason, one of the initiated. At the end of a course of instruction, he professed himself to be no wiser than when it began, and he ridiculed the credulity of his brothers, who were staunch adherents of the new doctrine. However, he did not forget his lesson, and on going the same spring to his estate at Besancy, near Soissons, he took occasion to mesmerize the daughter of his agent and another young person for the toothache, and they declared themselves in a few minutes cured. This questionable success was sufficient to lead M. de Puysegur, a few days after, to try his hand on a young peasant of the name of Victor, who was suffering with a severe fluxion on his chest. What was M. de Puységur's surprise, when, at the end of a few minutes, Victor went off into a kind of tranquil sleep, without crisis or convulsion, and in that sleep began to gesticulate and talk, and enter into his private affairs. Then he became sad, and M. de Puységur tried mentally to inspire him with cheerful thoughts. He hummed a lively tune to himself inaudibly, and immediately Victor began to sing the air. Victor remained asleep for an hour, and awoke composed, with his symptoms mitigated. The case of Victor revolutionized the art of mesmerism. The large part of his life, in which M. de Puységur had nothing to do but to follow this vein of inquiry, was occupied in practicing and advocating a gentle manipulation to produce sleep, in preference to the more exciting means which led to the violent crises in Mesmer's art. I have no plea for telling how M. de Puységur served in the first French revolutionary armies, how he quitted the service in disgust, how narrowly he escaped the guillotine, how he lived in retirement afterwards, benevolently endeavoring to do good to his sick neighbors by means of mesmerism, how he survived the Restoration, and how, finally, he died of a cold caught by serving in the encampment at Reims at the coronation of Charles X. For he had fulfilled his mission the day that he put Victor to sleep. He had made a vast stride in advance of his teacher. Not but that Mesmer must frequently have induced the same condition, but he had passed it by unheeded as one only of numerous equivalent forms of salutary crises, or that M. de Puysegur himself estimated, or had the means of estimating, the real nature and value of the step which he had made. To himself he appeared to be winning a larger domain for mesmerism, when in fact he had emerged into an independent field, into which mesmerism happened to have a gate. The state which he had induced in Victor was common trance, the initiatory sleep followed by half-waking. He had obtained this result by using the odd force with quietness and gentleness, leaving out the exciting mental agencies to which the mixture of violent seizures in Mesmer's practice is attributable. The gentler method has been adopted and practiced by the successors of M. de Puysegur, by Des Luz, Bertrand, Georget, Rostron, Foissac, Elliotson, and others. To Dr. Elliotson, the most successful, probably, certainly the most scientific employer of the practice of mesmerism, the credit is due of having introduced its use into England. The credit, for it required no little moral courage to encounter the storm of opposition with which his honest zeal in the advocacy of an unpopular practical truth was met. It is but fair to add that though his theory has been superseded, and his method changed, to Mesmer belongs the merit of having first tracked out and realized this path of discovery. The golden medal is his. The modern practice of mesmerism contemplates two objects. One, the application of the odd force to produce local effects. The other, its employment to induce trance. In the present slight sketch, I shall say nothing on the first subject, but let me describe how trance is induced. It is to be observed that attention to certain conditions favors very much the success of the experiment. The room should not be too light. Very few persons should be present. The patient and the operator should be quiet, tranquil, and composed. The patient should be fasting. The operator has then only to sit down before the patient, who is, likewise, sitting with his hands resting on his knees and gently closed, with the thumbs upwards. The operator then lays his hands half open upon the patient's, pressing the thumbs against those of the patient, as it were taking thumbs. This is a more convenient attitude than taking hands in the ordinary way. The operator and the patient have then only to sit still. An odd current is established, and if the patient is susceptible, he will soon become drowsy, and perhaps be entranced at the first sitting. Instead of this, the two hands of the operator may be held horizontally with the fingers pointed to the patient's forehead, and either maintained in this position or brought downwards in frequent passes opposite to the patient's face, shoulders, arms, the points of the fingers being held as near the patient as possible without touching. It is easy, theoretically, to explain the beneficial results which follow from the daily induction of trance for an hour or so, in various forms of disorder of the nervous system, in epilepsy, in tic douloureux, in nervous palsy, and the like. As long as the state of trance is maintained, so long is the nervous system in a state of repose. It is more or less completely put out of gear. It experiences the same relief which a sprained joint feels when you dispose it in a relaxed position on a pillow. A chance is thus given to the strained nerves of recovering their tone of health, and it is wonderful how many cases of nervous disorder will get well at once through these simple means. And it is certain that there is no disease in which the nervous system is not primarily or secondarily implicated. It is impossible to foresee what will prove the limit to the beneficial application of mesmerism in medical practice. In operative surgery, the art is not less available. In trance, the patient is insensible, and a limb may be removed without the operation exciting disturbance of any kind. And what is equally important, in all the after-treatment, at every dressing, the process of mesmerizing may be resorted to again, with no possible disadvantage, but being rather soothing and useful to the patient, independently of the extinction of the dread and suffering of pain. The first instance in which an operation was performed on a patient in this state was a celebrated case of Madame Platon. It occurred 20 years ago. The lady was 64 years of age, and labored under scurhus of the breast. She was prepared for the operation by M. Chapelain, who on several successive days threw her into trance by the ordinary mesmeric manipulations. She was, then, like an ordinary sleepwalker, and would converse with indifference about the contemplated operation, the idea of which, when she was in her natural state, filled her with terror. The operation of removing the diseased breast was performed at Paris on the 12th of April, 1829, by M. Jules Cloquet. It lasted from 10 to 12 minutes. During the whole of this time the patient, in her trance, conversed calmly with M. Cloquet, and exhibited not the slightest sign of suffering. Her expression of countenance did not change, nor was the voice, the breathing, or the pulse at all affected. After the wound was dressed, the patient was awakened from the trance, and when, on learning that the operation was over, and seeing her children round her, Madame Platon was affected with considerable emotion, whereupon M. Chapelain, to compose her, put her back into a state of trance. I copy the above particulars from Dr. Fossac's Rapports et Discussions de l'Académie Royale de Médecine sur le magnétisme animal, Paris, 1833. My friend Dr. Warren of Boston informed me that, being at Paris, he had asked M. Jules Cloquet if the story were true. M. Cloquet answered, "Perfectly." "Then why," said Dr. Warren, "have you not repeated the practice?" M. Cloquet replied that he had not dared, that the prejudice against mesmerism was so strong at Paris that he probably would have lost his reputation and his income by so doing. It has been mentioned that in ordinary trance the mind appears to gain new powers. For a long time we had to trust to the chance turning up of cases of spontaneous trance, in the experience of physicians of observation, for any light we could hope would be thrown upon those extraordinary phenomena. Now we possess around us, on every side, adequate opportunities for completely elucidating these events, if we please to employ them. The philosopher, when his speculations suggest a new question to be put, can summon the attendants of a trance as easily as the Jupiter of the Iliad summoned a dream, or, looking out for 2 or 3 cases to which the induction of trance may be beneficial, the physician may have in his house subjects for perpetual reference and daily experiment. A gentleman with whom I have long been well acquainted, for many years chairman of the quarter sessions in a northern county, of which during a late year he was high sheriff, has, like M. de Puysegur, amused some of his leisure hours, and benevolently done not a little good, by taking the trouble of mesmerizing invalids, whom he has thus restored to health. In constant correspondence with, and occasionally having the pleasure of seeing this gentleman, I have learned from him the common course in which the new powers of the mind, which belong to trance, have developed under its artificial induction. The sketch which I propose to give of this subject will be taken from his descriptions, which, I should observe, tally in all essential points with what I meet with in French and German authors. The little I have myself seen of the matter I will mention preliminarily. In some, instead of trance, a common fit of hysterics is produced. In others, slight headache, and a sense of weight on the eyebrows, and difficulty of raising the eyelids, supervene. In one young woman, whom I saw mesmerized for the first time by Dupotet, nothing resulted but a sense of prickling and tingling whenever he pointed with his hand, and her arm on 1 or 2 occasions jumped in the most natural and conclusive manner when, her eyes being covered, he directed his outstretched finger to it. A gentleman about 30 years of age, when the mesmerizer held his outstretched hands pointed to his head, experienced no disposition to sleep, but in 2 or 3 minutes he began to shake his head and twist his features about. At last his head was jerked from side to side and forwards and backwards with a violence that looked alarming. But he said, when it was over, that the motion had not been unpleasant, that he had moved in a sort of voluntary, although he could not refrain from it. If the hands of the operator were pointed to his arm instead of his head, the same violent jerks ensued, and gradually extended to the whole body. I asked him to try to resist the influence by holding his arm out in strong muscular tension. This had the effect of retarding the attack of the jerks, but when it came on, it was more violent than usual. I have lately seen another similar case. The seizure is evidently a form of St. Vitus' dance, brought out by the operation of the odd force. In neither of these two cases could trance be induced. A servant of mine, aged about 25, was mesmerized by La Fontaine for a full half-hour, and no effect appearing to be produced, I told him he might rise from the chair and leave us. On getting up he looked uneasy, and said his arms were numb. They were perfectly paralyzed from the elbows downwards, and numb to the shoulders. This was the more satisfactory that neither the man himself, nor La Fontaine, nor the 4 or 5 spectators expected this result. The operator triumphantly drew a pin and stuck it into the man's hand, which bled, but had no feeling. Then, heedlessly, to show it gave pain, La Fontaine stuck the pin into the man's thigh, whose flashing eye and half-suppressed growl denoted that the aggression would certainly have been returned by another, had the arm, which should have done it, had not been really powerless. However, M. La Fontaine made peace with the man by restoring him the use and feeling of his arms. This was done by dusting them, as it were, by quick transverse motions of his extended hands. In 5 minutes nothing remained of the palsy but a slight stiffness, which gradually wore off in the course of the evening. Occasionally partial tonic spasm, improperly termed catalepsy, for it is of the nature of catechus, and the rigidity attending it is absolute, supervenes as the only consequence of mesmerizing a limb. This result, which is not less alarming to the patient who has not been led to expect it than the preceding, may be got rid of in the same way. If you point with your fingers to the rigid muscles, or again, as it were, dust the limb with brisk transverse passes, or breathe upon it, the stiffness is thawed and disappears. Trance is seldom induced by mesmeric passes without more or less partial muscular rigidity of this kind supervening. It always yields to the means which have been mentioned. Genuine and ordinary trance I have seen produced by the same manipulations in from 3 minutes to half an hour. The patient's eyelids have dropped, he has appeared on the point of sleeping, but he has not sunk back upon his chair. Then he has continued to sit upright, seemingly insensible to the loudest sounds or the acutest and most startling impressions on the sense of touch. The pulse is commonly a little increased in frequency, the breathing is sometimes heavier than usual. Occasionally, as in Victor's case, the patient quickly and spontaneously emerges from the state of trance sleep into trance half-waking, a rapidity of development which I am persuaded occurs much more frequently among the French than with the English or Germans. English patients, especially, for the most part, require a long course of education, many sittings, to have the same powers drawn out, and these are by far the most interesting cases. I will describe, from Mr. Williamson's account, the course he has usually followed in developing his patients' powers, and the order in which they have manifested themselves. On the first day, perhaps, nothing can be elicited, but after some minutes the stupor seems, as it were, less embarrassing to the patient, who appears less heavily slumbrous and breathes lighter again, or it may be the reverse, particularly if the patient is epileptic. After a little, the breathing may be deeper, the state one of less composure. Pointing with the hands to the pit of the stomach, laying the hands upon the shoulders, and slowly moving them along the arms down to the hands, the whole with the utmost quietude and composure on the part of the operator, will dispel this oppression, and the interest of the first sitting is confined to the process of awakening the patient, which is one of the most marvelous phenomena of the whole. The operator lays his 2 thumbs on the space between the eyebrows, and, as it were, vigorously smooths or irons the eyebrows, rubbing them from within outwards 7 or 8 times. Upon this, the patient probably raises his head and his eyebrows, and draws a deeper breath, as if he would yawn. He is half awake, and blowing upon the eyelids, or the repetition of the previous operation, or dusting the forehead by smart transverse wavings of the hand, or blowing upon it, causes the patient's countenance to become animated. The eyelids open, he looks about him, recognizes you, and begins to speak. If any feeling of heaviness remains, any weight or pain of the forehead, another repetition of the same manipulations sets all right. And yet this patient would not have been awakened if a gun had been fired at his ear, or his arm had been cut off. At the next sitting, or the next to that, the living statue begins to wake in its tranced life. The operator holds one hand over the opposite hand of his patient, and makes as if he would draw the patient's hand upwards, raising his own with short successive jerks, yet not too abrupt. Then the patient's hand begins to follow his, and, often having ascended some inches, stops in the air cautiously. This fixed state is always relieved by transverse brushings with the hand, or by breathing in addition on the rigid limb, and it is most curious to see the whole bodily frame, over which the spasmodic rigidness may have crept, thus thawed joint by joint. Then the first effect shown commonly is this motion, the patient's hand following the operator's. At the same sitting he begins to hear, and there is intelligence in his countenance when the operator pronounces his name. Perhaps his lips move, and he begins to answer pertinently, as in ordinary sleepwalking. But he hears the operator alone best, and him even in a whisper. Your voice, if you shout, he does not hear, unless you take the operator's hand, and then he hears you too. In general, however, now the proximity of others seems in some way to be sensible to him, and he appears uneasy when they crowd close upon him. It seems that the force of the relation between the operator and his patient naturally goes on increasing as the powers of the sleepwalker are developed. But this is not necessarily the case. It depends upon its being encouraged by much commerce between them, and the exclusion of others from joining in this trance communion. And now the patient, beginning to wake in trance, hearing and answering the questions of the operator, moving each limb, or rising even, as the operator's hand is raised to draw him into obedient following, enters into a new relation with his mesmerizer. He adopts sympathetically every voluntary movement of the other. When the latter rises from his chair, he rises. When he sits down, he sits down. If he bows, he bows. If he makes a grimace, he makes the same. Yet his eyes are closed. He certainly does not see. His mind has interpenetrated, to a small extent, the nervous system of the operator, and is in relation with his voluntary nerves and the anterior half of his crânio-spinal cord. These are the organs by which the impulse to voluntary motion is conveyed and originated. Further into the other's being he has not yet got. So he does not what the other thinks of, or wishes him to do, but only what the other either does, or goes through the mental part of doing. So Victor sang the air which M. de Puysegur only mentally hummed. The next strange phenomena marks that the mind of the entranced patient has interpenetrated the nervous system of the other a step farther, and is in relation besides with the posterior half of the crânio-spinal cord and its nerves. For now the entranced person, who has no feeling or taste or smell of his own, feels, tastes, and smells everything that is made to tell on the senses of the operator. If mustard or sugar be put in his own mouth, he seems not to know that they are there. If mustard is placed on the tongue of the operator, the entranced person expresses great disgust, and tries as if to spit it out. The same with bodily pain. If you pluck a hair from the operator's head, the other complains of the pain you gave him. To state in the closest way what has happened, the phenomena of sympathetic motion and sympathetic sensation thus displayed are exactly such as might be expected to follow if the mind or conscious principle of the entranced person were brought into relation with the crânio-spinal cord of the operator and its nerves, and with no farther portion of his nervous system. Later, it will be seen, the interpenetration can extend farther. But before this happens, a new phenomenon manifests itself, not of a sympathetic character. The operator contrives to wake the entranced person to the knowledge that he possesses new faculties. He develops in him new organs of sensation, or rather helps to hasten his recognition of their possession. It is to be observed, however, that several who can be entranced cannot be brought as far as the present step. Others make a tantalizing half advance towards reaching it thus, and then stop. They are asked, "Do you see anything?" After some days, at length they answer, "Yes." "What?" "A light." "Where is the light?" Then they intimate its place to be either before them, or to one side, or above or behind them, and they describe the color of the light, which is commonly yellowish, and each day it is pointed to in the same direction, and is seen equally whether the room be light or dark. Their eyes in the meantime are closed, and here with many the phenomenon stops. Others in this light now begin to discern objects held in the direction in which they see it. The range of this new visual organ, and the conditions under which it acts, are different in different instances. Sometimes the object must be close, sometimes it is best seen at a short distance, but seen it is. The following experiment, which is decisive, was made at my suggestion. A gentleman standing behind the entranced person held behind him a pack of cards, from which he drew several in succession, and, without seeing them himself, presented them to the new visual organ of the patient. In each case she named the card right. The degree of light suited to this new mode of vision is variable. Sometimes bright daylight is best. Sometimes they prefer a moderate light. Some distinguish figure and color when the room is so dark that the bystanders can distinguish neither. These observations, which are, however, only in conformity with similar evidence from many other quarters, I give on the authority of Mr. J. W. Williamson of Wickham, the gentleman to whom I have before alluded. The following accidental features attending the manifestation of transposed senses were further observed by Mr. Williamson. In most of the persons in whom Mr. Williamson has brought out transposed vision, the faculty has been located in a small surface of the scalp behind the left ear, and to see objects well, the patient has held them at the distance of 5 or 6 inches from and opposite to this spot. One young woman, who had been temporarily set aside under affliction for the loss of a relative, on the experiments being resumed, saw from all parts of the head, but confusedly, a broken and incomplete picture. On a subsequent day she saw with the right side of her head. Afterwards the visual sense returned to its first place. In one young person the new sentient organ was on top of her head, and to see objects she required them to be brought into contact with it. Once that she had a rheumatic cold and tenderness of the scalp, she said, when entranced, putting her hand to the crown of her head, that the cold had made her eyes sore. One person saw objects best when placed behind her at the distance of 7 or 8 feet. The governess in a neighboring family was mesmerized for tic douloureux. In 7 sittings she was cured. At the second sitting, in her trance, she exhibited displaced sensation. She could read with her finger ends. Her way was to hold the book open against her chest, the back of the book towards her with one hand. Then she passed a finger of the other hand slowly over each word to read it. The part physical character of these phenomena is shown by an observation of Dr. Petitin's on the first of his cataleptic patients. At the time that the patient heard with the pit of her stomach, he found that if, with the fingers of one, say the left hand, he touched the pit of her stomach, and whispered to the fingers of his right hand, the patient heard him. But if the left hand was removed to the smallest possible distance from the patient, the contact being interrupted, she no longer heard him. Then he made a chain of 7 persons, holding each other's hands. The nearest to the patient was her sister, who touched the pit of her stomach. At the other end was Dr. Petitin, who whispered to his fingers, and was heard. A cane was then introduced as part of the circuit. The patient still heard, but if a stick of sealing wax or a glass rod was substituted for it, or if one of the party wore silk gloves, the patient could no longer hear Dr. Petitin. Without close observation, what is physical in the phenomena which have thus engaged us is liable to be overlooked, and the bystander may class them as examples of lucidity, which they are not. Organic cooperation may be traced in them all. Thus, among Mr. Williamson's earlier experiments, he tried, sitting before the entranced person, who had shown no lucidity, by imagining strongly to himself a white horse, to force the image into her mind. When, being awakened, she had left the room, on her way she said to her fellow servant, "What was it the master said to me about a white horse? I am sure he said something." Mr. Williamson, on learning the maid's remark, supposed his mental operation had been successful. But the same experiment, when repeated, mostly failed. At last he found out why. It only succeeded when, in his mental urgency, he half made, in his own throat, the motions of the sounds that expressed the mental image. Then, and then only, the patient caught it, for her mind could not read his thoughts, but as yet had penetrated the inferior part of the nervous system only, the craniospinal cord, and being there, had adopted sympathetically the voluntary impulses that were there performed. So she half moved the muscles of her own vocal organs to express the idea, and from that, its imperfect expression, received it into her thoughts. No doubt the phenomena of Victor singing the words of M. de Puyseguer's mentally hummed air was the same with the above, and not one of mesmeric lucidity, the subject which we are now approaching. But I pause, and go no further. For my subject in these letters, generally, has been to establish principles, and the phenomena of lucidity developed in artificial trance have only been the same as, and have not been as yet made more of than, the lucidity of catalepsy. No further principle has yet emerged from their study, and my special object in this letter has been to persuade the opponents of mesmerism to do it justice, and I think I am most likely to attain my end by not attempting to prove too much, so that nothing remains for me to do but to observe the form in which these letters were originally shaped, in recollection of the pleasant hours which the residence of your family at Beaupard during the winter of 1844-45 caused me, and to say, finally, dear Archie, farewell. End of section 10. Recording by Olivia.